Alina was 3 years old when the world became too loud for her. Before that terrible night, she was like any other little girl. She would giggle when her mama tickled her feet, ask endless questions about everything she saw, and sing made-up songs while playing with her dolls. Her voice was sweet and clear, always filling their small apartment with chatter and laughter. But children are like delicate flowers. Sometimes when storms hit too hard, they close up to protect themselves. That's exactly what happened to Alina. On a cold Tuesday evening in October, her father had come home angry again. This wasn't unusual. He often came back from work with a dark cloud hanging over his head, complaining about his boss, about money, about everything that went wrong in his day. But this time was different. When her mama tried to calm him down, he raised his hand and struck her across the face. Little Alina watched from behind the kitchen door, her small body frozen with fear. She saw her mama fall to the floor, saw the tears streaming down her face, heard the awful silence that followed. In that moment, something inside Alina's heart cracked like thin ice on a winter pond. The next morning, when her mama asked if she wanted pancakes for breakfast, Alina just stared. When the mailman waved hello, she didn't wave back. When her favorite cartoon came on television, she sat perfectly still. As if the sound couldn't reach her anymore, days turned into weeks, and Alina remained silent. Her parents took her to doctors, thinking maybe she was sick. The doctors checked her ears, her throat, everything they could think of. But there was nothing wrong with her body. The problem was deeper than that, buried somewhere in her heart where words used to live. Her father left 3 months later. One morning, Alina woke up and half of his clothes were gone from the closet. Her mama cried for days, but Alina felt nothing. The man who had brought fear into their home was gone, but the silence he had created in Alina stayed behind like an unwelcome guest who wouldn't leave her mama. Maria had to work twice as hard now to pay for everything. She took a job at a clothing factory, sewing buttons onto shirts for 10 hours a day. Her fingers would come home sore and pricked with needle marks, but she never complained. She would just look at Alina with tired, worried eyes and wonder where her little girl's voice had gone. Because Maria worked so much, Alina spent most of her time with Uncle Giuseppe. He owned a small music shop on the ground floor of their building. The shop was cramped and dusty, filled with old guitars, violins, and sheet music that turned yellow at the edges. But in the back corner stood something magical, an old piano that Uncle Giuseppe had bought years ago, and he still dreamed of being famous. Uncle Giuseppe was different from other adults, Alina knew. He had thick, gray hair that stuck up in all directions and wore sweaters with holes in the elbows. Most importantly, he never tried to make Alina talk. He seemed to understand that sometimes people need silence the way plants need shade. Giuseppe had once been a real pianist, the kind who wore fancy clothes and played in big concert halls. But life had played a cruel trick on him. His hands, which had once danced across piano keys like butterflies, now ached with arthritis. The disease made his fingers stiff and painful, stealing away his dreams, one note at a time. Alina would sit quietly in the music shop while Uncle Giuseppe worked. She would watch him repair broken instruments or help customers find the right violin strings. But what she loved most was when the shop was empty and Uncle Giuseppe would sit at the old piano. When he played, something magical happened. Despite his painful hands, beautiful music would flow from the piano like water from a spring. The melody seemed to tell stories without using any words at all. Alina would creep closer, drawn by the music like a moth to candlelight. She noticed that when Uncle Giuseppe played sad songs, tears would slip down her cheeks. When he played happy songs, something warm would flutter in her chest. It was as if the piano was speaking a language she had always known but never heard before. Other people noticed Alina's connection to music too. Mrs. Chen, who ran the flower shop next door, would sometimes see Alina through the window. The little girl would be standing perfectly still next to the piano, tears streaming down her face, but her expression wasn't sad. It was something deeper than sadness, something that looked almost like relief. That child hears something that rest of us don't, Mrs. Chen would tell her husband. Music speaks to her in a way that words never could. Uncle Giuseppe began to notice Alina's reactions too. Whenever he played, she would appear like a quiet shadow, standing just close enough to feel the music vibrate through the floorboards. Her dark eyes would become wide and focused, as if she were drinking in every single note. One afternoon, when Alina was 5 years old, Uncle Giuseppe was teaching a lesson to a teenage boy who wanted to learn guitar. The boy was struggling with a simple song, playing the same wrong notes over and over again. Alina sat in her usual corner, watching and listening. After the student left, Uncle Giuseppe noticed Alina standing next to the piano. Without saying anything, she reached up and pressed a single key, then another, then another. The notes she played were the correct ones the guitar student had been trying to find. Uncle Giuseppe's eyes widened. "How did you know that, little one?" Alina didn't answer, of course.
What?
But she looked up at him with eyes that seemed to hold secrets deeper than the ocean. From that day on, Uncle Giuseppe paid closer attention to Alina's relationship with music. He noticed that she could tell. When instruments were out of tune, just by the expression on her face, she could predict which songs would make customers happy or sad before they even finished listening. The music shop became Alina's refuge from a world that expected her to speak. While other children her age were learning to read and write in school, Alina was learning a different kind of language. She was learning to understand the conversations that instruments had with each other, the stories that melodies told, and the emotions that lived inside every note. Her mama worried constantly. She would ask Alina's teachers what to do, but they had never dealt with a child like this before. Some suggested therapy, others thought Alina would grow out of it. But as months turned into years, it became clear that Alina's silence wasn't temporary. It was part of who she had become. At night, the music shop was closed and the building was quiet. Alina would sometimes sneak downstairs. She would sit at the piano bench, too small to reach the pedals, and just look at the keys. She wouldn't play. She was too afraid of making noise and waking people up. But she would imagine what it would feel like to let her fingers dance across those black and white keys. The piano seemed to call to her like it was waiting for something. Alina didn't know what that something was, but she could feel it growing, stronger every day. It was as if all the words she had never spoken were gathering inside her heart, waiting for the right moment to find their way out. Uncle Giuseppe would sometimes find her there in the mornings, curled up asleep on the piano, benched like a cat who had found the perfect sunny spot. He would gently carry her back upstairs to her mama, never mentioning these midnight visits, but he knew that something special was building inside his silent niece. He could see it in the way she looked at the piano, like she was seeing an old friend she hadn't talked to in years. He could feel it in the way the air seemed to change when she was near the instruments. Alina was 7 years old now. Her silence had become as much a part of her as her dark hair and quiet smile. She communicated with nods and shakes of her head, with drawings and gestures, but never with words. The world had taught her that speaking could lead to pain. So she had chosen safety and silence. But inside her heart, music was growing like a garden in spring, waiting for the right moment to bloom. Alina was 7 years old when everything changed. It was a Tuesday morning in March, and spring was just beginning to peek through the winter cold. Uncle Giuseppe had been feeling tired for weeks, but he kept saying it was just the weather making his old bones ache. That morning, Alina was eating her breakfast of toast and jam when she heard a strange sound from downstairs. It wasn't the usual noise of Uncle Giuseppe opening the music shop or tuning instruments. It was different, a heavy thud, followed by silence. Her mama had already left for work at the clothing factory, so Alina was alone in the apartment. She put down her toast and listened carefully. The building was too quiet. Uncle Giuseppe always hummed old Italian songs while he worked, but today there was nothing. Alina crept down the stairs to the music shop. The front door was still locked, but she had her own key that Uncle Giuseppe had given her months ago. As she pushed open the door, she saw him lying on the floor next to the counter, his face pale and his breathing shallow. Even though Alina didn't speak, she knew what to do. She picked up the phone and dialed the number for help, then pointed to Uncle Giuseppe when the paramedics arrived. The men in uniforms were kind to her, even though she couldn't tell them what had happened at the hospital. The doctors said Uncle Giuseppe's heart was tired and needed rest. He would be fine, they promised, but he needed to stay there for a few days. Elena's mama came rushing from work, her face worried and her hands still smelling like the fabric softener from the factory. "You'll have to stay with Mrs. Chen next." "Dor," her mama said, stroking Elena's hair. "Just until Uncle Giuseppe feels better." But Elena shook her head. She pointed toward the music shop, and then to herself. She wanted to stay there, surrounded by the instruments that had become her friends. Her mama looked uncertain, but Mrs. Chen offered to check on Elena every few hours. For the first time in her life, Elena was completely alone in the music shop. The silence felt different now, not scary, but full of possibilities. She walked slowly between the rows of guitars and violins, running her fingers along their smooth surfaces. But it was the piano in the back corner that called to her most strongly. She had spent countless hours watching Uncle Giuseppe play, memorizing every movement of his fingers, every expression on his face when he touched the keys, knew which keys made high sounds and which ones made low sounds. She had learned to read his emotions in the way he pressed the keys, gentle for sad songs, firm for happy ones. Elena climbed onto the piano bench, her small legs dangling above the floor. The keys looked different from this angle, like a row of white and black teeth waiting to bite or smile. She had never actually touched them before, only watched and listened. Her right hand reached out slowly, trembling slightly. Her index finger pressed down on middle C, and the note rang out clear and pure in the empty shop. The sound seemed to travel through her finger, up her arm, straight into her heart. It was like touching magic. She pressed another key, then another. The notes didn't make a song yet, but they were talking to her in a language she had always understood but never spoken. Each key had its own voice, its own personality. Some were bright and cheerful, others were deep and mysterious. Elena's left hand joined her right, and suddenly she was playing, not the careful, measured way Uncle Giuseppe had taught his students, but something that came from deep inside her chest. The music poured out of her, like water breaking through a dam. She played melodies she had never heard before, songs that seemed to come from a place inside her where all her unspoken words had been hiding. Her fingers moved across the keys with a grace that seemed impossible for someone so young, someone who had never had a real lesson. The music that flowed from the piano was unlike anything the neighborhood had ever heard. It wasn't the cheerful songs that Uncle Giuseppe played for his students, or the classical pieces he performed when he thought no one was listening. This was something entirely different, raw, emotional, and heartbreakingly beautiful. Mrs. Chen was arranging flowers in her shop window when the music began. She froze, a yellow daisy still in her hand, and listened. The melody seemed to wrap around her heart and squeeze gently, bringing tears to her eyes without her understanding why. "Impossible," she whispered to herself. "That can't be the little girl." But as she listened longer, she knew it was true. The music was coming from Elena, the child who had never spoken a word, who communicated only through nods and gestures and sad, knowing smiles. Other people began to notice too. Mr. Rodriguez, who ran the bakery across the street, stepped outside to listen. The mail carrier stopped in the middle of sorting letters. Even the stray cats that lived in the alley seemed to gather closer to the music shop, drawn by the sound. Elena played for hours, losing herself completely in the conversation between her heart and the piano keys. She played all the sadness she had felt when her father left, all the worry she carried about her mama working so hard, all the love she felt for Uncle Giuseppe and his kind, patient ways. But she also played things she had never experienced. Hope, joy, and a kind of freedom she had never known existed. The piano seemed to understand everything she couldn't say, and it helped her say things she didn't even know she felt. When Uncle Giuseppe returned from the hospital 3 days later, he found Elena still at the piano. She'd been taking breaks to eat the food Mrs. Chen brought her and to sleep on the small couch in the shop office. But most of her time was spent at the keys. He stood in the doorway, listening to his niece play a piece he had never heard before. It was complex and beautiful, full of technical skill that should have taken years to develop. But more than that, it was full of emotion, the kind of deep feeling that came from someone who had lived through pain and found a way to transform it into something beautiful. "Alina, my dear child," he whispered, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Where did you learn to play like this?" Alina looked up at him and smiled, the first real smile he had seen from her in years. She couldn't tell him in words that she had learned by watching him, by listening to every note he had ever played, by absorbing music through her skin and bones. She couldn't explain that, while other children were learning to speak and read. She had been learning a different kind of language, one that didn't need words, one that came straight from the soul. Instead, she simply began to play. Again. This time, she played a song she had heard Uncle Giuseppe play many times, a gentle Italian lullaby his own mother had sung to him as a child. But Elena's version was different. It was the same melody, but filled with her own understanding, her own emotions, her own voice. Uncle Giuseppe sat down heavily in his old chair, the one he used when teaching students. He watched Elena's small fingers dance across the keys with the confidence of someone who had been playing for decades, not days. "You have a gift, little one," he said softly. "A gift that goes beyond what most people can understand." Alina nodded, but she didn't stop playing. She had found her voice at last, and it was more beautiful than any words could ever be. From that day forward, the music shop became a different place. Alina would play every day, sometimes for hours at a time. Uncle Giuseppe began teaching her properly, showing her how to read music and understand the technical aspects of playing. But he quickly realized that Alina didn't need to learn music the way other people did. She absorbed it naturally, like a plant absorbing sunlight. She could hear a song once and play it perfectly. She could look at sheet music and understand it as easily as other people read books. The neighborhood began to change too. People would find excuses to walk past the music shop, hoping to catch a few moments of Elena's playing. The sound of her music drifted through the streets like a gentle blessing, touching hearts and healing old wounds. Alina had found her voice, and the world was finally ready to listen. By the time Alina turned 13, her gift had become both a blessing and a curse. She could now play pieces that made grown men weep. Compositions so beautiful they seemed to reach into people's hearts and pull out emotions they didn't even know they had. But with this incredible ability came a loneliness that grew deeper with each passing year. High school was especially difficult for Alina. While other teenagers were discovering their voices through endless chatter about movies, music, and crushes, Alina remained as silent as ever. She communicated through carefully written notes, handed to teachers when necessary. But mostly she just observed the world around her with those dark, knowing eyes. The other students didn't know what to make of her. Some ignored her completely, treating her like she was invisible. Others were fascinated by her silence, whispering stories about why she never spoke. A few cruel ones would try to startle her into making a sound, clapping loudly behind her, or shouting her name in the hallways, but it was the ones who discovered her musical talent that caused Alina the most pain. Word had spread through the school about the girl who could play piano like a professional. Soon, students who had never spoken to her before were suddenly her best friends, at least when they needed something. "Alina, can you play at my birthday party?" they would ask, sliding written requests across her desk. "Alina, my boyfriend loves piano music. Could you play something romantic for us?" "Alina, we need music for the school talent show. We'll do it right." Alina wanted to help. She wanted to be useful, to be liked, to feel like she belonged somewhere. Instead, she said yes to almost everything, writing her agreement in neat handwriting on small pieces of paper. But each time she performed for these students, she felt a little piece of her soul being chipped away. They didn't really see her. They saw her talent, her gift, her usefulness. Alina herself, the girl who had been hurt so deeply that words had become impossible, remained invisible to them. The teachers weren't much better. They praised her musical abilities while completely failing to understand the person behind the music. Her English teacher would write comments on her papers, saying things like, "Excellent work, but I wish you would participate more in class discussions." Her music teacher treated her like a performing monkey, always asking her to play for visiting parents or school board members. "Look what our school can produce," the principal would say proudly when Alina played at school events. "Such talent, such dedication." But none of them ever asked Alina how she felt about being displayed like a trophy. At home, things were getting worse too. Alina's mama had started drinking more after work. It began innocently enough, a glass of wine to help her relax after long days at the factory. But gradually, one glass became two, then three, then an entire bottle that would leave her mama. Slumped on the couch, staring at the television with empty eyes, Maria felt trapped in her own life. She worked 10 hours a day at a job that paid barely enough to cover rent and groceries. Her dreams of a better life seemed to slip further away with each passing year. And watching Elena's incredible musical talent bloom only made her own failures feel more painful. Why can't you be normal? Maria would sometimes say when she'd had too much to drink. Other mothers have daughters who talk to them, who share their problems. All I have is this silent child who plays piano all day. Alina would sit at the kitchen table during these moments, writing responses on paper that her mama often didn't bother to read. She wanted to explain that she did want to share her problems, that she had so much to say, but couldn't find a way. To say it, she wanted to comfort her mama, to tell her that everything would be okay. But Maria was dealing with her own pain, her own broken dreams, and sometimes that pain made her blind to her daughter's struggles. The only person who truly understood Alina was Uncle Giuseppe, but his health was getting worse. The heart attack had been just the beginning. Now he had good days and bad days, and the bad days were becoming more frequent. On his good days, he would sit with Alina in the music shop and listen to her play. He understood that her music was different from anything he had ever heard. It wasn't just technically perfect, though it was that too. It was emotionally honest in a way that most professional musicians never achieved. You play with your whole soul, little one, he would tell her. Most people spend their whole lives trying to find that kind of honesty in their music. Uncle Giuseppe had begun teaching Alina more advanced pieces, but he quickly realized that she didn't really need traditional teaching. She learned by feeling, by listening. By some mysterious connection to the music that went beyond normal understanding, Alina could listen to a piece of classical music once and not only play it perfectly, but improve upon it. She would add her own emotional touches, her own interpretations that somehow made the music more beautiful than the original composer had intended. But with this gift came a terrible burden. Alina began to feel responsible for everyone's emotions. When she played sad music, she could see people in the audience crying and would wonder if she had hurt them. When she played happy music, she felt pressured to make everyone feel better. Late at night, the music shop was closed and the building was quiet. Alina would sit at the piano and play for herself. These were the only times when her music was truly free, when she could express everything she felt without worrying about how it affected others. She would play her frustration at being unable to speak, her sadness about her mama's drinking, her worry about Uncle Giuseppe's failing health. She would play her confusion about growing up, her fear of the future, her desperate desire to connect with other people in a meaningful way. These midnight concerts became Alina's therapy, the only way she could process the complicated emotions of being a teenager with an extraordinary gift and an ordinary need to be understood. Sometimes Mrs. Chen would hear the music drifting through the walls and would sit by her window, listening to the sound of Alina's heart breaking and healing. At the same time, she understood that the girl was pouring her soul into those keys, transforming pain into something beautiful. As Alina approached her 15th birthday, she began to realize that her gift was becoming a prison. People expected her to play whenever they wanted, however they wanted. They expected her music to be perfect, to make them feel better, to solve their problems, but Alina was still just a girl who had been hurt long ago and had never found her way back to words. She was still someone who needed comfort, understanding, and genuine friendship.
Oh.
The piano had given her a voice, but it had also made her feel more alone than ever. Uncle Giuseppe noticed the change in Alina's playing. There was a new sadness in her music, a kind of desperate longing that hadn't been there before. He worried that the gift that had saved her was now becoming a burden too heavy for her young shoulders to carry. Music should set you free, not trap you, he told her one evening as they sat together in the shop. Don't let other people turn your gift into their expectation. Alina nodded, but she didn't know how to change things. She had spent so many years being silent that she didn't know how to set boundaries, how to say no, how to protect herself from people who wanted to use her talent. The music that had once been her salvation was becoming her cage, and Alina didn't know how to find the key to set herself free. Alina was 19 when her world collapsed completely. It started on a cold February morning when she found Uncle Giuseppe sitting in his favorite chair, looking peaceful but still. Too still. The man who had been her anchor, her teacher, and her only true friend was gone. The funeral was small, but filled with people whose lives Uncle Giuseppe had touched. Former students came to pay their respects. Neighbors shared stories of his kindness, and musicians from around the city spoke about his talent and generosity. Alina sat in the front row, dry-eyed but hollow, listening to people talk about the man who had saved her life without ever expecting anything in return. When the lawyer read Uncle Giuseppe's will, Alina discovered that he had left her the music shop. Everything, the building, the instruments, the old piano that had become her voice, was now hers. Along with it came a mountain of responsibilities she wasn't sure she could handle. The neighborhood around the music shop was changing rapidly. Big companies were buying up old buildings and turning them into expensive apartments and fancy coffee shops. Property taxes were rising, and small businesses like Uncle Giuseppe's were struggling to survive. Alina received her first offer to sell the building, just 3 days after the funeral. A man in an expensive suit knocked on the door, expressing his condolences before quickly moving on to business. The amount he offered was more money than Alina had ever imagined, enough to pay for college, enough to start over somewhere new, enough to pursue her musical dreams in ways Uncle Giuseppe never could. But selling would mean losing the only place where her music had ever made sense. The shop wasn't just a business to Alina. It was the sanctuary where she had discovered her voice, where every corner held memories of Uncle Giuseppe's patient teaching and gentle encouragement. Alina's mama had her own opinions about the situation. Maria had been struggling more than ever since Uncle Giuseppe's death. Without his steady presence and occasional financial help, she was barely keeping her head above water. The drinking had gotten worse, and some nights she wouldn't come home at all. "Take the money," Maria told Alina one evening, her words slurred from wine. "Sell this old place and get us out of here. You could go to one of those fancy music schools, become somebody important." Alina wrote her response on a piece of paper. "This place is important to me." "Important?" Maria laughed bitterly. "Alina, you're 19 years old and you've never even had a real conversation with another person. You spend all your time hiding behind that piano. Maybe it's time to join the real world." The words stung because Alina knew there was some truth in them. She had become so dependent on her music to communicate that she sometimes wondered if she had forgotten how to be anything else. But the idea of leaving the shop, of abandoning the place where Uncle Giuseppe's spirit still lingered, felt like losing herself completely. The financial pressure mounted quickly. Alina had never handled money or business before. Uncle Giuseppe had always taken care of the practical things while she focused on music. Now, she was drowning in bills, taxes, decisions she didn't know how to make. The shop's income was barely enough to cover basic expenses. Few people were buying instruments anymore, and the music lessons that had once provided steady income died with Uncle Giuseppe. Alina could play beautifully, but teaching required patience and communication skills she didn't possess. More developers came knocking, each offer higher than the last. The man in the expensive suit returned several times, his smile getting wider and his voice more insistent each visit. "Miss Alina," he would say, "this neighborhood is going to change whether you want it to or not. You can either profit from that change or be crushed by it." Alina felt trapped between two impossible choices: keep the shop and risk losing everything, when she couldn't afford to maintain it, or sell and lose the one place in the world where she truly belonged. During this difficult time, Alina's playing changed dramatically. Her music became more intense, more desperate. She would play for hours each night, her fingers moving across the keys with a kind of frantic energy that seemed to pour all her fear and confusion into sound. The neighbors began to take notice. Mrs. Chen would stand outside her flower shop in the evenings, listening to the haunting melodies that drifted from the music shop. Other people started gathering too, workers heading home from late shifts, couples taking evening walks, elderly residents who had trouble sleeping, Elena's music had always been beautiful,
Ow.
but now it was something more. It was the sound of a soul fighting for survival, of someone clinging to the only thing that made life meaningful. People who heard it felt something deep in their chests, a recognition of their own struggles and dreams. One of these listeners was Michael Torres, a journalist who had moved to the neighborhood recently. He was writing a series of articles about how gentrification was affecting local communities, and he had become fascinated by the mysterious music that seemed to soundtrack the neighborhood's transformation. Michael began investigating the source of the music. He discovered that it came from the old music shop, and that the player was a young woman who had never spoken a word in public. The more he learned about Elena's story, the more captivated he became. He started arriving earlier, each evening, notebook in hand, trying to understand how someone so young could create music that felt ancient and wise. He interviewed neighbors, former customers of the shop, and anyone who had known Uncle Giuseppe. Slowly, Michael began to piece together Elena's remarkable story. The trauma that had stolen her voice, the uncle who had shown her another way to communicate, the extraordinary gift that had bloomed from pain and silence. Elena noticed the journalist too. She saw him standing with the other listeners, but there was something different about him. While others seemed lost in the emotion of her music, he was studying it, trying to decode something hidden in the melodies. One evening, Michael approached the shop door after Elena had finished playing. He knocked gently and waited. When Elena appeared, he smiled and held up a piece of paper with a simple question written on it. "May I ask you about your music?" Elena studied his face for a long moment. She could see genuine curiosity there, not the grabby needs she had encountered so often in high school. This man wasn't trying to use her or exploit her talent. He was trying to understand something deeper. She gestured for him to come inside, and they sat across from each other in the dusty shop. Michael had prepared pages of questions. He quickly realized that Elena's answers came not through words but through music. When he asked about her childhood, she played a piece that sounded like loneliness and fear transformed into something beautiful. When he asked about Uncle Giuseppe, she played a melody so full of love and gratitude that Michael felt tears forming in his eyes. For the first time in years, Elena felt truly heard. Not her music, not her talent, but her actual story. Michael listened with his whole being, and somehow that made all the difference. As their evening conversations continued, Elena began to realize that her story might matter to people beyond her small neighborhood. Michael was talking about writing an article about sharing her experience with a wider world. The idea terrified and excited her in equal measure. Part of her wanted to remain hidden, safe in her silence and her music. But another part wondered what might happen if she let herself be truly seen for the first time in her life. The decision about the music shop was still weighing on her. But now there was another possibility beginning to form. Maybe her voice. Her real voice expressed through music could reach people she had never imagined. Maybe her silence had something important to say to a world that had forgotten how to listen. Michael's article appeared in the city newspaper on a Sunday morning in May. Everything changed for Elena. The headline read, "The Silent Symphony, One Woman's Journey from Trauma to Triumph Through Music." But it was the story itself that captured hearts across the city. Michael had written about Elena with deep respect and understanding. He didn't sensationalize her silence or treat her like a curiosity. Instead, he painted a picture of a young woman who had found a way to transform pain into beauty, who had discovered that sometimes the most powerful voices speak without words. The article described Elena's childhood trauma, Uncle Giuseppe's gentle guidance, and the extraordinary music that now filled the old shop each evening. But most importantly, it captured something essential about what Elena's story meant, that healing comes in many forms, and that sometimes our greatest gifts emerge from our deepest wounds. Within hours of the newspaper hitting stands, Elena's phone started ringing. The calls came from everywhere. Music schools wanting to offer her scholarships, record labels interested in her unique story, concert halls hoping to book performances. News stations wanted interviews, documentary filmmakers pitched their ideas, and booking agents promised to make her famous. Elena sat in the music shop, staring at the ringing phone with a mixture of wonder and terror. This was what she had always thought she wanted: recognition for her music, validation for her gift. But now that it was happening, she felt overwhelmed by the noise and chaos of it all. Michael continued visiting the shop, helping Elena navigate. The sudden attention, he had become something like a translator between Elena's silent world and the speaking world that wanted to reach her. Through written notes and musical responses, Elena communicated her thoughts and feelings about each opportunity. The most prestigious offer came from Lincoln Center in New York. They wanted Elena to perform a solo concert, with proceeds going to support music therapy programs for traumatized children. The idea was beautiful, but Elena had never performed for more than a handful of people at once. "You don't have to do anything you're not ready for," Michael assured her, reading the concern in her eyes. "Your music has already touched thousands of people just through the article. You've already made a difference." But Elena surprised everyone, including herself, with her response. She wrote a simple note. "Uncle Giuseppe always said music should heal people. Maybe it's time to try." However, Elena had one condition that shocked the music industry. She didn't want to perform at Lincoln Center or any other famous venue. She wanted to stay right where she was, in Uncle Giuseppe's music shop. If people wanted to hear her music, they could come to the place where it had been born. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within days, people began traveling from all over the country just to stand outside the small music shop and listen to Elena play. The sidewalk filled with listeners every evening, young and old, rich and poor. People from every background imaginable. Elena played for them from inside the shop, her music floating through the open windows and doors. She couldn't see most of their faces, but she could feel their presence, their attention.
Ow.
Their hearts opening to the melodies that poured from her soul. Something magical began happening in the neighborhood. The developers who had been pressuring Elena to sell suddenly found themselves surrounded by crowds of people who came to hear her play. Property values rose, not because of luxury apartments, but because of the beauty that Elena's music brought to the streets. Local businesses thrived as visitors needed places to eat and stay. Mrs. Chin's flower shop became a gathering place, where people shared stories about how Elena's music had affected them. The bakery across the street started staying open late to serve the evening crowds. The city government, recognizing the cultural significance of what was happening, designated the music shop as a protected historic site. Elena would never have to worry about developers again, but the most important change happened within Elena herself. For the first time in her life, she began to understand the true power of her gift. Her music wasn't just beautiful sounds, it was a language that spoke directly to people's hearts, a way of connecting with others that transcended the need for words. Letters began arriving from around the world. A soldier wrote about how hearing Elena's music on a recording had helped him process his trauma from war. A mother shared how playing Elena's songs had helped her daughter speak for the first time after a traumatic experience. Teachers wrote about using Elena's story to help their students understand that there are many ways to find your voice. Elena read every letter, often with tears in her eyes. She had spent so many years feeling alone and misunderstood, but now she realized that her silence had given voice to millions of others who felt voiceless. Record labels still called, offering huge contracts and promising worldwide fame. But Elena's response was always the same. She would point to the music shop, to the crowds of people who gathered each evening, to the community that had grown around her music. This was enough. This was everything. Elena did make some concessions to the modern world. She allowed her evening concerts to be recorded and shared online, so that people who couldn't travel to hear her could still experience her music. She partnered with music therapy organizations, donating a portion of the money from album sales to help other traumatized children find their voices. Michael's article had opened doors to a bigger world, but Elena chose to stay in the small world, where she felt safe and understood. She transformed the upstairs apartment, where she had grown up, into a music therapy center, working with children who, like her, had found that words weren't always the best way to communicate. Elena never did learn to speak again, but she discovered that she didn't need to. Her music said everything that needed to be said. When people asked her questions through written notes, she would respond by playing pieces that somehow contained complete answers. Her evening concerts became a neighborhood tradition that lasted for years. People would bring blankets and chairs, turning the street in front of the music shop into an outdoor concert hall. Children grew up listening to Elena's music, and when they became adults, they brought their own children to hear the woman who spoke through piano keys, Elena's mother. Maria eventually found her way back from the darkness that had consumed her. Hearing her daughter's story told with such respect and understanding helped her realize how much strength Elena had always possessed. She got help for her drinking problem and slowly rebuilt her relationship with her daughter. Learning to communicate through music and written notes, Mrs. Chen often said that Elena had saved the neighborhood. But Elena knew the truth was more complicated than that. The neighborhood had saved her too. By giving her a place where her difference was celebrated rather than feared, where her silence was respected rather than seen as a flaw. The community had allowed her to bloom. Years passed and Elena's story became legend. Music schools taught courses about her unique approach to communication. Therapists used her techniques with patients who struggled to express themselves through words. Her life became proof that healing takes many forms, and that sometimes our greatest gifts come from our deepest wounds. Elena never became famous in the traditional sense, never performed at Carnegie Hall or won Grammy Awards. But she became something more important, a beacon of hope for anyone who had ever felt different, misunderstood, or voiceless. In the end, Elena's silence had spoken louder than any words ever could. Her music became a universal language that reminded people of their shared humanity, their common struggles, and their infinite capacity for healing and connection. The girl who had stopped speaking at age 3 had found a way to say everything that mattered most.